Hey there, my name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. This is episode 201, and I'm calling it, Why Do We Crave Salt? I thought this was a good time of the year to get into the business of cravings and comfort food. Because let's face it, the long cold winter months, I guess I'd be talking to people north of the equator, tend to be a time when we're looking for foods to warm us up, and these foods tend to have a higher content of both fat and salt. By the way, there's a caveman reason, at least in part, why we crave calorically dense foods in the winter. Calories are literally heat energy. Also, this may be a guess on my part, but I think the shorter days and longer periods of time indoors may be a psychological factor playing a part in why we tend to eat more fat and salt in the winter months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's talk about specifically what it is, and I'll get into the types of salt later, and what it does, and why it's important. And then why we might be craving either salt specifically or salty comfort foods in general. Okay, so what is salt? Literally, it is sodium chloride. So about half of the weight of salt is actually sodium. Actually, less than half of the sodium intake comes from the salt shaker. Now, I understand that almost no one is into biochemistry, but if you are, salt is actually a neutral compound because sodium is positively charged. It has a +1 ion, and chloride is negatively charged, -1. And the two are attracted to each other. And why can't we all get along, for goodness sake? Now, sodium is an electrolyte, and it's essential. And what I mean by essential is that our body does not manufacture sodium, and we need to get it from food, and we will die without it. Sodium has an important role to play in the fluid balance inside our body, or, as it was put by the nut job in Dr. Strangelove, our precious bodily fluids. More specifically, the fluids outside of our cells are involved in transport, and that transport involves sodium. So, sodium ions are essential for the contraction of muscles and heart. They're also involved in the transmission of nerve impulses in your brain. So sodium is necessary. But as everyone knows, we can have too much salt, and we can have too little salt. By the way, I might interchange the words sodium and salt, and I apologize for that ahead of time. But I think we all know I really mean sodium. There's been a lot of talk about designer salts, and here I do mean salt. There's been talk about what they can do for you, or perhaps not do for you. I'll run through these different salts briefly. First, you have your basic table salt. We are all familiar with the round blue box, which is Morton's iodized salt. Now, you may or may not be wondering why salt has added iodine in it. Iodine is actually a micronutrient that is used to make thyroid hormone, and it's essential, which means that our bodies can't produce it on its own. Back in the old Dust Bowl days, when people were starving and living on white rice, iodine deficiency was a problem, but it isn't any longer. 1 serving of table salt, or 1/4 teaspoon, gives you about 45% of your daily requirement for iodine, which is more than enough. And, oh yes, 1/4 teaspoon has 590 milligrams of sodium. The next on our list of salts is regular sea salt. Now, sea salt contains a small amount of natural iodine, although not nearly as much as in iodized table salt. Sea salt is less refined than table salt, and it comes in both fine and coarse varieties. Sea salts also contain magnesium, potassium, and calcium. Some people feel that these sea salts taste better, but this may be subjective. Are we imagining that it tastes better? I don't know. But either way, it's fine. Now, the third type of salt is pink Himalayan rock salt. This is rich in minerals, as above, and some other trace elements. I happen to like the taste of this, and yes, I do think it tastes better, but I just use it in cooking. There are claims that pink Himalayan salt may help control blood sugar or even the pH of your bodily fluids, but these claims have not been proven. Now, number 4 on the list is Celtic sea salt. This is a completely unrefined, unprocessed salt, and it's sourced from the clean coastal waters along Brittany in France. This is often called gray sea salt, and it's apparently harvested by traditional craftsman-type harvesting methods. Maybe like mining for gold in them hills, but I'm not sure. Well, I'm guessing. And then you can get what I call flavored sea salt, which is your basic sea salt with added dried herbs. Now, first let's talk about sodium deficiency and get that over with. As for the conditions where you might have a sodium deficiency, I'm just going to touch on them briefly because most of them are medical conditions that require a physician's care. Low blood sodium is called hyponatremia, and it's literally a low amount of sodium in your bloodstream. Symptoms are reduced hydration, obviously, lethargy, muscle cramps, confusion, headaches, weakness, and irritability. I know you're thinking, boy, that sounds like me. But it probably isn't, because a sodium deficiency is rare. But you could have everything else. Now, elite athletes can get a deficiency in sodium because it's one of the electrolytes they'll lose when they're excessively sweating during a marathon or a long bicycle race. For the rest of us, simply sweating on a hot day should not cause cramps and can be easily fixed by drinking water or drinks with electrolytes. Okay, next come a couple of diseases that again I will only mention because you will need to be under a doctor's care if you have them. One of them is Addison's disease, a condition where your adrenal glands do not put out enough hormones. These hormones regulate blood pressure, and untreated Addison's disease can result in a very low blood pressure and salt cravings. Another rare condition is something called Barrier's syndrome, a rare genetic disorder where the kidneys cannot reabsorb sodium and all of the sodium is lost in the urine. Again, this is a serious medical condition which should not be treated with salt. There is one more serious condition here that needs to be treated medically. Patients with lung cancer can develop low sodium levels. This can be for many reasons, including the need for high doses of diuretics, adrenal insufficiency related to cancer, or renal failure. It goes without saying that lung cancer should not be treated by increasing salty foods. Now, as for pregnant and premenstrual women, in pregnancy, our needful electrolytes will go up slightly. The average American diet, pregnant or otherwise, will more than compensate for the slight increase in electrolyte needs. The exception would be if the pregnant woman is experiencing vomiting and cannot take in enough food or fluids. But again, in this case, do not self-treat. The obstetrician generally admits the woman for IV fluids, which will include electrolytes. Now, as far as premenstrual symptoms or PMS symptoms go, a craving for salty foods may be part of what a woman will experience. This craving may be partly due to hormonal fluctuations, but it does not signal a deficiency in sodium. Contrary to popular belief, our bodies are actually pretty good at regulating our salt levels. Under normal healthy conditions, if you take in more salt, then you lose more salt through your kidneys. So that takes care of the physical reasons why we might crave salt. Like sugar, since the caveman days, we have had an instinctual need to crave salt in order to control blood pressure during periods of fasting. The theory is that salt was scarce during prehistoric days, and our hypothalamus produces hormones that will dictate cravings for salt. Our bodies generally need about 2,300 milligrams of sodium. That is when we're young and healthy. As we age and may develop chronic conditions like, say, diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, or cardiovascular disease, we should aim for about 1,500 to 1,800 milligrams of sodium per day. And that's not too much. Again, most of us will excrete what we don't need, but some of us won't. And again, if you're curious as to whether or not that might be you, you need to maybe speak to your doctor about that. There was a controversial statement about African Americans and hypertension, first put forth by Dr. Oz about 10 years ago, and it goes like this. When West Africans in the 17th and 18th centuries were first dragged onto slave ships and endured the brutal trip across the ocean, often 1/3 of them died during the trip. Medical scientists looked into why some Africans survived when others died. They theorized that Africans that were larger or had a better adapted ability to retain salt had a better chance of survival. And that's because the cause of death was usually dehydration from inadequate fluid intake and, of course, dysentery, which made it worse. So the offspring of those survivors may have had a greater ability to retain salt and keep their blood pressure high. Now, enter the age of the salt shaker in high sodium processed foods. Now that many of us have become overweight, and African Americans as much as anyone, African Americans do have a significantly higher blood pressure and related cardiovascular issues. Because our basic problem now is overfeeding, it's become difficult to limit our sodium intake to 2,000 milligrams per day. Just to give you some examples, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce has 1,000 milligrams of sodium. A small serving of canned soup is about 1,200 milligrams. A single slice of bread, 150 to 200 milligrams of sodium. And salad dressing has about 500 milligrams for a small serving. Ouch. But it's not a simple matter of intake when it comes to sodium in high blood pressure. Japanese Americans use a lot of soy sauce and don't have as much hypertension as overweight Americans do. And it's not a simple assumption that we crave salt only because our prehistoric ancestors did. It's complicated, but I bet you knew that. Here are some of the psychological reasons why we may crave salty foods. Number 1, stress. Salty foods are often comfort foods. That's a big fat duh. And stress leads us to crave our favorite comfort foods. Not surprisingly, they usually contain a lot of salt and sugar. But some foods that have sodium don't appear to be salty. I was surprised when I found out that a Danish has 400 milligrams of sodium. And it's not just chips. For example, cookies and crackers have a great deal of sodium as well. Even cheese and crackers, which sounds less junky, can tack on about 2,000 milligrams of sodium. But there's also maybe physiological factors triggered by stress that may play a role in all of this. I imagine we've all heard about cortisol and how it gets released when we're under a lot of stress. Cortisol gets released when we hit our head, but it also gets released when we're driving and someone cuts us off. Doctors used to use the example of a lion charging at them that gives us a sudden jolt of cortisol. But let's use a modern example. We're driving along the highway daydreaming or fighting with someone on the cell phone, and suddenly the car coming in the opposite direction crosses over to our lane and swerves toward us at a high rate of speed. Even if it misses us, we will have cortisol running through our bloodstream. Our heart will start beating rapidly, we'll start sweating. We all know the feeling. But chronic low levels of stress may produce chronic low levels of cortisol. And that seems to be taking a toll on our bodies. There's a study out, or more than one study, but I'll give you the link to the one I have, where they looked at the effects of stress on our craving for salt or sugar. They measured hormone levels, cortisol, as well as appetite-related hormones such as insulin, ghrelin, and leptin. Levels of ghrelin had been altered when under stress. This stressed-out group craved salt and gained weight. The researchers put out the theory that it was related to a rise in ghrelin. The second psychological factor is boredom. Now, when we're bored, we want, wait for it, fun. Of course we do. Who wouldn't want fun? There was an old ad for Brigham's ice cream that said, "It's hard to be sad when you're eating ice cream." Ditto for fried dough, pizza, and chocolate chip cookies. By the way, these are called selective cravings, which are cravings for specific foods. So a person may crave their favorite candy bar or burger or bag of potato chips. So boredom is a factor. The third factor is sleep deprivation. My personal theory about this, that is shared by almost no one, is that sleep deprivation makes us feel sorry for ourselves. They've done studies on sleep deprivation and unhealthy food cravings. And why not? Turns out they go hand in hand. Sleep-deprived people eat more salty foods. Number 4 is a loss of taste perception. When we've got a cold and a stuffy nose, you can't smell your food or taste your food, and you want that pleasurable sensation that you get when you eat those comfort foods, because after all, you have a cold and you are feeling sorry for yourself, maybe. See item 3. So you may jack up the salt because you want to at least taste something. Number 5, alcohol intake. We may be eating more salty snacks like peanuts and chips when we're drinking because the alcohol lowers our inhibition and, I imagine, our willpower. So is too much sodium always bad for us? As I mentioned above, not always. But again, as we age, we may lose our ability to get rid of all that extra sodium, and our blood pressure may start to creep up. Too much sodium is associated with, obviously, high blood pressure, which will make diabetes worse. Ditto for heart disease. It may also increase our risk of stroke and possibly kidney damage. And that's because as sodium levels rise in our precious bodily fluids, we retain extra fluid in order to dilute the sodium. This obviously leads to fluid retention and bloating, which brings our blood pressure up. And yes, I know, changing habits can be difficult. We've established lifetime habits that can come from a particular culture or just family get-togethers and social occasions. What I might recommend instead of removing salty snacks is to replace the salty snacks with other foods that contain fiber. For example, it's better to do peanuts instead of chips. Or you could make your own pita chips by getting a good quality pita bread, cutting it up in 8 triangles, coating them with olive oil, and baking them at a high temperature in the oven. Voila! Reduced sodium pita chips. And, I don't mind repeating myself, this is another argument, perhaps, for going with a plant-based diet. You will lose weight, which is what most of us want to do, and your blood pressure will automatically come down with the weight. As always, if you have any medical conditions, you should always seek the advice of your healthcare professional. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.